No matter what it looks like, this is not a video about abortion. This is a video about philosophical arguments, using arguments about abortion as examples. I want to illustrate the practice of looking at the premises, the evidence offered in support of a position, and evaluating those premises as true or false, or relevant or irrelevant. For example, what we have here is a representation of the pro-life argument, the argument that abortion is immoral. An argument, in philosophical lingo, is a set of two or more propositions, where one proposition, called the conclusion, is said to follow from the truth of the others. The conclusion in this case is the proposition that it's wrong to abort a fetus. The premises in this argument consist of the propositions that are offered as proof that it's wrong to abort a fetus. Note that they follow a chain of reasoning, a chain of inferences, that ultimately are said to show that the conclusion, that it's wrong to abort a fetus, is true. And here is a representation of the standard pro-choice argument. The conclusion in the pro-choice argument is that anybody may, that is to say, it's morally permissible to, abort a fetus. And this conclusion is said to follow from its own set of premises. As you can see in both of our examples, arguments can have smaller arguments embedded within them. The pro-life argument first establishes that it's wrong to kill a fetus. The pro-choice argument establishes that people have a right to deny to other persons the non-consensual use of their body. If you think that the conclusion of an argument such as this is false, then you need to identify one of two types of problems with that argument. One thing you can try to do is to show that at least one of the premises is false. Another is to show that the premises, even if they're true, aren't relevant to the conclusion. They don't provide evidence that the conclusion is true. But if you can't do that, then the argument is doing a good job of showing that its conclusion is in fact true. Note that it's not enough to assert that there's a different argument that leads to a conflicting conclusion. That only shows that there's a mistake somewhere. It doesn't tell us where to find that mistake. We have these two arguments supporting conflicting conclusions. It seems there has to be a problem somewhere, but where? It could be in this argument, or it could be in the other argument. To show that one's own position is correct, a part of the job is showing what's wrong with that other argument. Let me illustrate how a debate between a pro-life philosopher and a pro-choice philosopher might proceed. A common target for critics of the pro-life position is to deny the truth of the premise that the fetus is a person. This would mean that the fetus has no moral rights, and the fetus can't be wronged by a woman having an abortion. In response to this criticism, the person defending the pro-life position can argue that the burden of proof is on the critic. One can point to the countless examples in which the moral status of people has been ignored in human history, blacks, women, aboriginal tribes, precipitating horrendous moral atrocities. One can infer from this that the burden of proof doesn't rest on the shoulders of those who would assert personhood, but on those who would deny it. Okay, the critic says, here's my reason for denying personhood. The fetus has no rights because it lacks consciousness. Only conscious creatures can have rights. Now the defender can respond to that objection by pointing out that unconscious people still have rights. If I knock you unconscious while you're lying on the floor unconscious, you would still have rights. Okay, so the critic tries a different objection. The critic says that the fetus isn't a person because it lacks the capacity to feel pain. Note that the critic isn't saying the fetus is not a person because it's not feeling pain, but the fetus is not a person because it lacks the capacity to feel pain. But here, the defender can point out that there's a genetic condition where those who have it can't experience pain. And yet they have rights. It's a condition called congenital insensitivity to pain and anhidrosis. As for anhidrosis, people with this genetic condition also don't perspire. But they're persons. They have rights. The critic could perhaps argue that the fetus is not a person because the fetus doesn't have any interests. It is in this sense that the fetus is like an appendix. It knows nothing, it understands nothing, it cares about nothing. And the defender could respond to this objection by saying that temporarily lacking interests doesn't deprive a person of moral rights. We can imagine a disease, call it COVID-20 3/4, that causes the brain to shut down completely for, let's say, 9 months. During those 9 months, the person is technically dead, with less of a claim to having rights than a fetus. But we are assuming that if we keep the body alive for 9 months, the virus will eventually disappear and normal brain functions return. While this person is suffering the effects of the disease, they would still have rights. Somebody who walked into the hospital room and unplugged all of the cords, keeping the body alive, would be guilty of a murder. Okay, instead of trying to criticize the premise that says the fetus is an innocent person, the critic could try to criticize the premise that says that to abort a fetus is to kill a fetus. How might one defend that objection? Okay, denying somebody the use of one's body isn't killing them. People have perfectly good kidneys that they don't need. Refusal to give somebody a kidney who needs a kidney to survive is not the same as killing that person. In the case of McFall versus Shimp in 1978, Robert McFall needed a bone marrow transplant to survive. His cousin, Robert Shimp, was the only eligible donor, but Shimp refused. McFall sued Shimp for a bone marrow transplant. The court sided with Shimp, citing the principle one human being is under no legal compulsion to give aid or to take action to save another human being or to rescue. Even if one defends a duty to give aid in the form of material assistance, one can argue that this duty does not include a duty to give others the use of one's body. If it did, then we could obligate people to give organs or to participate in medical experiments. Here, the pro-life critic might respond by saying that abortion is not a case of refusing to take action. The person seeking or the person performing an abortion does take action. This makes it much more like the case of unhooking a patient from the machines keeping that patient alive, discussed above. Now, this exchange is getting us close to the claims made in the pro-choice argument. So let's look at that argument. Note that with this pro-choice argument, the pro-choice defender can accept the personhood of a fetus. No person has a right to the use of another person's body without their consent. Rape, compulsory organ donation, one's right to refuse to participate in medical research, each of these deny other people, genuine people whose lives may be at stake, any right to the use of one's body without the consent of that individual. It's a right that even criminals retain. Here, the pro-life individual, trying to discredit this argument, might argue that there's an exception when the individual does something that puts another person in a position where life depends on that individual's help. But the pro-life person would have to admit that here we're looking at a case in which a woman consented to sex. This couldn't be used in the case of rape or where a woman is considered below the age at which one is capable of giving informed consent. The defender of the pro-choice position might then object that this would seem to imply that a woman who walks down a dark alley gives permission to the use of her body by a rapist, if she knew that there was a risk that her body would be so used. Or anybody who drives on a public road may be considered responsible for being hit by a drunk driver, since if they hadn't been using the roads, they wouldn't have been hit. Another possible response that the pro-choice defender might make is to point out that if one didn't have sex, which pro-life people say is legitimate, the situation for the child would have been no different. Whether a woman decides not to have sex or decides to have sex and abort any resulting fetus, the morally relevant result for the child is the same either way. The child gets no conscious existence, no harm is done, no wrong is committed. So as I said, my point here was not to resolve the debate on abortion. What I wanted to do is to show how philosophers approach issues such as abortion. We began with arguments supporting various positions. We examined possible weaknesses with those arguments by considering objections to the truth of the premises that aim to support those conclusions. It's a lot like a trial. with each side bringing up evidence to support the guilt or innocence of the accused and attempting to find weaknesses in arguments supporting the other position. The focus here is on whether certain propositions are true or false, and the evidence that can be found in support of either option.